This is Elora Andrews, and you're listening to an Oshawa Museum podcast. Our topic today will be a brief history of women's voting rights in Canada. The Oshawa Museum aims to educate and inspire our listeners with accurate historical information. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Canada has been a democracy since Confederation in 1867. Who has been allowed to participate in that democracy has continually evolved since that time. At the time of the Confederation, eligibility to vote was restricted on a number of issues, but all voters had to be male and own property of a certain value. Some non-property owners were also permitted to vote, depending on the amount of rent they paid monthly or annually, but the amounts were high enough that they excluded many. For over 50 years after Confederation, women in Canada were not permitted to vote. That changed for federal elections in 1918. Women's suffrage groups had existed since the 1870s, but during the war it was hard to ignore their arguments. Women were serving in the war, taking over from the men in factories and offices, holding families together while the men were overseas, and working in voluntary organizations that supported the war effort. They couldn't be kept out of political life any longer. Women got the federal vote in 1918, but history recalls that some women in Canada were given the privilege prior to this date. For example, over 200 years ago in 1809, women in Quebec who owned property had the right to vote. That is until 1849, when the word male was inserted into Quebec's Franchise Act. In 1885, Alberta women gained the right to vote in school elections and hold office in schools. This was the same year that Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald introduced the Electoral Franchise Act. The Dominion Women's Enfranchisement Association was created from the Canadian Women's Suffrage Association and the Campaigns for the Vote for Women in 1889. Only a year later, in 1890, women ratepayers were given the school vote in all provinces. In 1894, Northwest Territories, unmarried women were allowed voting in municipal election but were not allowed holding office. Black women voted for the first time in Nova Scotia in 1895, and in 1897 voted for municipal election for the first time. During this decade from 1890 to 1900, bills for the provincial enfranchisement of women were introduced into the legislatures of Ontario, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, and Quebec. They were all defeated. In 1900, under the Dominion Elections Act, the only people who could vote in a Canadian federal election were the ones who had the legal right to vote in provincial election. Minorities, including women, who were excluded from voting in provincial elections were therefore automatically excluded from voting in federal elections. Repeated efforts for female suffrage were made in British Columbia in 1902, 1903, and 1906, but they were defeated. An effort was made in Montreal in 1903 to take away the municipal franchise of widows and spinsters. Great protest was raised, and this was voted down. The Manitoba Municipal Act was amended in 1907, which made women excluded as voters in municipal election despite the fact that they had been granted this right previously. In 1908, women householders were deprived of municipal franchise. A protest was raised and a bill introduced to restore it was defeated. During the years 1910 and 1911, extensive work was done to amend the property laws for women and the guardianship of children. In 1913, a large petition for women's suffrage was submitted to the government, but this was refused. On January 27, 1914, a large group of women and men, and many members of the Political Equality League of Manitoba, appeared before the Manitoba Legislative Assembly to make the case for women's suffrage. They were led by well-known writer and suffragist Nellie McClung, who would later be known for her role in the groundbreaking Persons case. McClung asked the members of the legislature, "Have we not the brains to think, hands to work, hearts to feel, and lives to live?" She went on, "Do we not bear our part in citizenship? Do we not help build the empire? Give us our due!" In December 1915, the group delivered a petition containing almost 40,000 signatures in support of women's right to vote. Premier T.C. Norris delivered the petition to the first session of the 15th Legislature, followed soon after by a bill to amend the Manitoba Elections Act. On January 28, 1916, the Lieutenant Governor passed into law the right of Manitoba women to vote, and to put themselves forward as candidates in provincial elections. In March of 1916, Saskatchewan passed into law an act that amended the Saskatchewan Election Act, and on April 19th, Alberta passed the Equal Suffrage Statutory Law Amendment Act, both jurisdictions thereby granting women the right to vote and stand for election. Not too long after these acts were amended, on April 5th in 1917 British Columbia, an act to amend the Provincial Elections Act was instated. Ontario followed suit only 7 days later, as an act created to amend the Ontario Election Act was established. Canada, the wartime elections. The Wartime Elections Act of 1917 gave the vote to female relatives of Canadian soldiers serving overseas in the First World War. This included British subjects, otherwise qualified as to age, race, and residence, and the wife, widow, mother, sister, or daughter of any person in the naval forces, inside or outside Canada, or any person in the military forces, outside Canada, who was serving or served with Canada or Great Britain. The act was passed by Prime Minister Robert Borden's Conservative government in an attempt to gain votes in the 1917 election. 1918, Nova Scotia. An act to amend and consolidate the acts in respect to the electoral franchise is established, and not 1 month later was a Canada-wide act to confer the electoral franchise upon women enacted. This act allowed women who are British subjects, 21 years of age, and otherwise meet the qualifications entitling a man to vote, the right to vote in a Dominion election. On April 17, 1919, New Brunswick created an act to extend the electoral franchise to women and to amend the New Brunswick Electors Act. In 1928, there arose the question of the eligibility of women for the Senate. It was ruled out by the Supreme Court of Canada, and 5 women from Alberta, Judge Emily Murphy, Mrs. Nellie McClung, Mrs. Lois C. McKinney, Henriette Muir Edwards, and Irene Parlby appealed to the Privy Council with success. Thus was established in 1929 women's right to sit in the Canadian Senate. In 1930, Miss Karen Ray Mackay Wilson was appointed the first woman senator. In Quebec, 1940, a new act granting women the right to vote and to be eligible as candidates was established. In the Northwest Territories, 1951, an ordinance was passed respecting the franchise of electors and the election of members to the Council of the Northwest Territories. The first black woman elected to provincial office was Rosemary Brown. She became a member of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia in 1972, representing the BC New Democratic Party. In 1984, Doreen Lewis, descendant of black loyalist Rose Fortune, was elected mayor of Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia. She was the first black female mayor in North America. That same year, Ann Cools was appointed to the Senate and was the first black person to hold that position. Finally, in 1982, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms embedded into the Constitution the right of all citizens to vote. This has been an Oshawa Museum podcast, brought to you by Elora Andrews. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our other historical video podcasts and subscribe to the channel.